order, please? Can I get y'all? It's great to have such a good crowd, but let's get to work. So here we are. I'm Fran Inman, Chair of the California Transportation Commission. And one point of order, if anybody is looking where to turn in their speaker card, Doug, if you can raise your hand over there, he is collecting them. So make sure everybody gets a chance to share with us. So with that, we are going to go first to our Pledge of Allegiance. So if you all join me, we will say the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, right back here. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Hey, this is, my goodness. We're a noisy crowd, that's all I can say. So anyway, thank you all for joining us today. This is our second combined meeting, and I would say let's roll up our sleeves and get together. It's great to be here at Metro. We wanted a great big room, and we got one, so it's great to have so many folks with us. I just really want to thank everybody for their engagement and for all of my fellow commissioners and the CARB board members for carving time out. This is important work for all of us to do together, and I know everybody has a gazillion things, and we tend to get working on our stuff, and I think the more we can sit around tables and roll up our sleeves and get work done together, it'll be great. So looking forward to the presentations today. I want to thank our staffs, both at the CTC and at CARB, because behind all of this there has been an awful lot of work that's been done. So these things look rather easy by the time we get here, but it's not, because there isn't an awful lot of hard work and commitment from hard-working, great staff. So join me and let's give our staffs a big shout out. Thank you. And I do see in the room a lot of our transportation partners and stakeholders, and it's absolutely fantastic that we have so many of you here with us today. And with that, we're going to defer the roll call. Unfortunately, we have some traffic issues and logistics issues on both boards this morning. So we're missing a few. Intel tells us that they're within range. But being one that kind of had to jump out of her car and transfer the keys, I know what that feels like. So we will call the roll once we, in about 10 or 15 minutes. So with that, I'd like to pass it to my fellow chair, Mary Nichols, for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Fran. So at our last meeting, we were in the Cali PA building, and the CTC members came to us. This time we're in a transportation facility, although it's not owned by the state. But I too want to thank the MTC for having us here. We've been hosted already this morning. We had a need to do a conference call earlier. We were given a room and tremendous kindness in helping us find our way around. So it's good to be here. And as you noted, the statute that told us that we needed to get together once or twice a year, every 6 months, was premised on the idea that coordination needed to happen and people needed to see that it was happening. And I think our first meeting was a good indicator of the fact that we could get together and just go over some very specific issues, but also share viewpoints and get to know each other better. And I view this as an opportunity to continue as we delve into some pretty deep waters on issues that are impending in the state with respect to climate and transportation. So thanks for chairing this time, and let's get to work.
All right, so today we do have a robust agenda, and typically we like to hear the public comments with each item, but today we're going to try to get through the bulk of the agenda and then engage our public comments, just out of fear that we won't get to cover the agenda that's set in front of us. So we welcome the public participation. I don't want you to feel discouraged at all. We want to hear from you, and you're welcome to comment later as well, I think. But Doug is collecting cards. So with that, I'd say we all get started. So I think we do have some of our assembly members here. I know we're going to call Chairman Frazier out when we do the roll call, but I also want to call him out right now. We do appreciate you joining us today. We appreciate all you've done for transportation and continue to do. We love your passion and support for the transportation sector. And Assemblymember Cervantes, is she here? Yeah, okay, good, you made it. I assume you didn't have a great commute either this morning, but thank you so much. And Assemblymember is really the statute that said, hey, you all need to sit around a table on a regular basis. So we thank you for that, and here we are, and so it's fun to see those come together. So do you want to make a statement, Assemblymember? Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning to all of our commissioners and board members, as well as my colleague, Assemblymember Frazier. It is great to be back at the second joint meeting of this collaboration with the CTC and CARB. As you know, this collaboration is a clear directive from Governor Brown to set forth our state's clean transportation policies. And you know, we need to ensure that we achieve this region by region, engaging every community, every stakeholder along this process. The recent election mandated by voters of this great state was clear and convincing. They want state dollars invested in a modernized system of transportation infrastructure. And this much is clear to me. The economic and environmental shift toward a clean economy is imminent. This week, I'm not sure if many of you had an opportunity to go down to the LA Car Show. You can go down there till December 9th. You will see a fleet of new electric vehicles. Announcements by General Motors, Volkswagen, and eventually Ford that full electric vehicle production is coming, and it's indicative of this trend. However, our goal is to identify solutions that make progress on all these efforts. As we know, this is already underway and within this realm. And moreover, recently, as we read the White House report on climate change, it presents this ideal opportunity to show how our state could, with proper planning and execution, can make real, meaningful change. And that is what we look forward to, what I look forward to engaging with many of you on in this year to come and beyond. Thank you for all of your hard work and your commitment to our great state.
Thank you, Assemblymember. Also, it's great to have Secretary Annis with us today. We really appreciate you joining us. It's important. You are our partner, and we truly appreciate that. So with that, I want to give a shout out to our friends at Metro for hosting us. We at the CTC don't have our own great big board meetings, so we partner with our friends on everything we do, including where we meet. So here we are, and is Phil Washington here? Okay, Phil, come on down.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Joint Committee. Let me just say that we appreciate your leadership. We thank you for your leadership as you lead in this area of the state. Welcome to Los Angeles. We're happy that you are here. We think that Los Angeles is the perfect place to talk about mobility, to talk about innovation and all the challenges that we face right now. Just wanted to go through just a brief deck here. You all know the area, and you know how many people that we have here. Lots of folks, lots of cars, the most populous county in the U.S., and a lot more people coming to Southern California in the next 40 years. LA County is really, really big. It is incredibly big. The last time I looked, LA County was larger than 42 states. Just the vast area that we service is just tremendous, and we believe that LA Metro is really uniquely situated to address the challenges facing CARB and the state. With this great population and the housing and transportation needs that are out there, we can be an incubator for innovation, which is what we are looking to do. LA Metro, just at a quick glance, third busiest transit system in the United States. We're behind New York and Chicago. We're gaining on Chicago. And I can say that because I'm originally from Chicago. So we're going to overtake Chicago. Lots of employees, huge fleet of buses, 2,300 buses, which, by the way, we are looking to electrify the whole fleet by 2030, 10 years before the state mandate of 2040. Lots of freeway HOV miles as well. We are in a very, very unique role where we are an operator, a builder, a funder, and a planner for the region. We also play a huge role in what I call transit-oriented communities, joint development, station area planning, funding to meet the sustainability community strategy. Right now, and I read the report, the recent report, I believe, from last week, where it talked about the state may not be reaching their targets, but we do have Measure M, we do have SB1 funded projects, and I believe that they are helping us reach those targets. Measure M, don't expect you to see all these lines, but the green is our transit projects, the blue are highway projects. We have 40 major highway and transit projects within the next 40 years. We are in full build mode, and that includes transit systems, highways, looking to make this a sustainable community in Southern California. Some of you have seen the pie chart here for Measure M. It is the most comprehensive program in North America, where we have the largest piece of this pie is transit projects. We have a slice for highway projects. We have a slice for local return. That is giving money back to the 88 cities in this county for them to do their local streets and roads. And then we are looking to become what I call the transportation center of excellence for this country. While we're implementing the largest transportation expansion program in America, this gives us a great opportunity in our minds to become the transportation center of excellence. And so we've put together a 5-point plan that talks about the idea of being the transportation center for excellence. This first point is mobility innovation. We are partnering with the private sector in a big way to implement mobility improvements. We created an office of what I call extraordinary innovation. We have evaluated over 100 unsolicited proposals, and what we're saying to the private sector is you do not have to wait for us to put out a request for a proposal or an RFP. We want your ideas unsolicited. We will evaluate those to see if they make sense. We have received, as I said, over 100 unsolicited proposals for very, very large transit projects and small projects as well, to include our mobility on demand, our micro-transit on-demand bus service that we're looking to implement right now. So we're confident that these transportation options will help us attract new riders as we implement these various plans. The second point is capturing the hearts and minds of people. And I often talk about how the car industry, they've done a great job over the years of making car ownership and driving a car very, very sexy. I mean, when you look at commercials, you have, the hair flowing in the wind, Matthew McConaughey, he's driving the Lincoln Navigator or whatever. So the question is, how do we capture the hearts and minds of people as it relates to public transportation? And so we are looking to do just that. We have a new Join the Movement video that is playing in prime time, looking to enhance the customer experience as we deliver these outstanding trip experiences for our customers. We also have put together a strategic plan, Vision 2028. It looks at the next decade and looks to put customer experience at the core of everything that we do. And we're also doing what we call a next-gen bus study. We are reimagining our entire bus service that we have on the street, starting from scratch and wiping the slate clean. We know that there are new employment centers around the county, new residential centers. So we're wiping that slate clean and putting out a whole new batch of bus service as we go forward. This is about a 15 to 18-month effort, and we will complete this effort and bring it to our board sometime mid-next year. The third piece of this 5-point plan is really embracing equity. And we took to our board what we call an equity platform for adoption. What we're saying here is that everything that we do, we will look through the lens of equity to see if it makes sense and is equitable for the communities in which we traverse. We want to look at every project through that lens, every infrastructure project, every bus route, through the lens of equity, and make sure that we are addressing this issue of service on the street, making sure that we are embracing equity in our transit-oriented communities, looking to prevent displacement and gentrification where we can. We understand that we do not control everything, but we can influence, instigate, and impact. So we're working with local cities and the county more than ever to work through zoning issues and funding issues to prevent more sprawl and build more infill housing. Around this equity piece, we are also looking to build career pathways in the infrastructure space. We're looking to build the workforce of the future. One of our big concerns is, do we have the workforce, the qualified workforce, to do all the projects that we have, that we've been asked to build, the construction job trades, the special trades, the hard-to-fill positions like track signal maintainers, signal inspectors. And so SB 375 can and should be a job creator, and we should sell it that way as well. Also in this embracing equity sort of category, and understanding that we are concerned, and we all should be concerned about the lack of a qualified workforce, we are developing a transportation school. A transportation school grades 9 to 12. We have kicked this off. We're partnering with the County of Los Angeles
with a focus on young people in those grades, kids in those grades from the foster care system, from at-risk kids that are in the system, with a focus on transportation infrastructure skill sets. The fourth plan in our five-point plan is fostering continuous improvement. We are looking to be responsive, accountable, trustworthy. We are, in this area, we are really focusing on our best practices and lessons learned as the guiding principles, also being a good steward of taxpayer dollars, of course. We don't take for granted the trust that the public has given to us through local sales tax measures, and so we're being very, very judicious in how we do that. And part of this is forging a new working relationship with the state across many different projects and programs. And then the final point is what I call stepping into leadership voids and really transforming transportation in LA County. It happens through a regional collaboration. As I said earlier, stepping into these leadership voids, we do not control everything, but we can influence, we can impact, we can instigate. We understand that mobility is really the foundation of our local and state economy, and we think sustainability will be a major industry in our state. And so, again, while we don't control these things, we can instigate, we can influence the lack of affordable housing. We can talk about the surplus of parking, too much parking, making it easier for people to drive. We can weigh in on those things. And then also stepping into leadership voids, remaking Union Station where you're at right now for the future to accommodate the many projects that we are building through Measure M. We are also looking to stand up what would be the first in this country full-on passenger rail car manufacturing facility. Right now, there are assembly facilities around the country, but there's no full-blown passenger rail car manufacturing facility. We want to stand one up right here in LA County. We think that the country and the need that we have right here in Southern California calls for that. We convened a group of rail car manufacturers from around the world this last August, and there's great interest in standing up a rail car manufacturing facility right here to make our region more sustainable. And then lastly, in terms of stepping into these leadership voids, we want to leave what I call an infrastructure inheritance for our children, not an infrastructure deficit. An infrastructure inheritance where our kids can talk about how this generation left this infrastructure inheritance, and we made the decisions that were necessary to protect them as we move forward in reducing our carbon footprint and building infrastructure in this country. So let me say that we appreciate the partnership. We appreciate the opportunity to highlight some of the things that we're doing. And lastly, thank you so much for your leadership.
Thank you, Phil. If you can stand by just a second, I want to see if my colleagues have any questions. But I have a couple of quick ones. Bears, Broncos, Rams, Chargers, do we?
I'm a fan of both unless they're playing each other.
Well, we're so delighted that you're here, and we really do appreciate your leadership. One thing that I was thinking about, a couple of things. One is we've got some games coming up. Maybe you want to opine a little bit about our transportation participation to really ensure that our Olympic Games are successful, and what lessons we've learned and what we're trying to really roll up our sleeves and accelerate, I think, so to speak. And then another question, this you don't need to answer this one, but I think it'd be good for all of us to get in the habit of sharing the 5 things that are keeping us up at night, or the 3 things that we wake up and we worry about, because I think that kind of will get us to the heart of what problems we really need to work on together. So that would be great. But if you could maybe just speak briefly about the Olympic Games. I say that as the former chair of the LA Chamber. I can never put that hat away. So we have partnered with Phil, and the business community has, on an ongoing basis. And clearly the success in landing the games is something that we're all very proud of.
Yes. Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. The 2028 Olympic Games is on our mind big time. We have an initiative called 28 by 2028. That is 28 projects that we are looking to complete by 2028. And these 28 projects are some highway projects. They are some transit projects. We have mobility on demand on that list. We are well on our way to complete those projects by 2028. Now, there are some challenges because 8 of the 28 projects are actually outside of the 10-year window when you look at the Measure M schedule. And so the challenge has to do with advancing the funds, the funding, and moving that funding up to be within the 10-year window. So that is our challenge. As a matter of fact, I'll be briefing the LA Metro Board this Thursday on some ideas to move that money up into the 10-year window to complete by the Olympic Games. And of course, one of the line items in that funding plan includes the state, some funding assumptions. So thank you in advance. So we're excited about that. We're excited about what we can do with 28 by 28. And then your other question, what keeps me up at night? I actually sleep pretty well, but right before I fall asleep, a couple of thoughts. One is as we put all of this work, this infrastructure work on the street, do we have the contractor capacity? That concerns me, the contractor capacity. I mean, we've got 28 by 2028, we've got a football stadium going up, we've got cranes all over Southern California. So do we have the contractor capacity? And I talk to contractors all the time, and we want to be able to implement all kinds of delivery methods, whether it's design build, design bid build, public-private partnerships as well. And so the question as we try to accelerate projects has to be, will the private sector take on risk to do, in this case, public-private partnerships and put money out there to advance our projects? The other thing that I think about right before I fall asleep is this issue of the qualified workforce, the lack of a qualified workforce. We need to grow our own for them to work on these projects. It's not that we don't have the pool of young people to work on these projects. The challenge is, how do we train them?
Chair Nichols, did you have any questions for Phil?
No questions. Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you. And I've been living in Los Angeles for many years now, and only recently begun to take advantage of your system. And I appreciate it very much. Appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.
How about any other questions, comments from the other colleagues on the dais? Okay, Phil, I guess you're off the hook, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, are we ready to take one? One more. Okay. We're still waiting for one more, so we'll delay our roll call. And we will move now to item number 3, Senate Bill 150, the report findings. And Carrie?
All right, good morning, and thank you, commissioners and board members and staff. My name is Carrie Connect, and I am a staff member with the California Air Resources Board Sustainable Communities section, and I'm very happy to be here today to share key findings from CARB's report to the legislature under Senate Bill 150 on the progress that has been made in reducing the greenhouse gas pollution from passenger vehicles under SB 375. This is a great time for us to take stock of our progress so far and to look ahead at the challenges to overcome. 10 years have passed since the adoption of SB 375 connected regional planning to state climate goals. Real progress has since been made. Under 375, regions create sustainable community strategies, or SCSs, as part of their regional transportation plans. These include strategies to meet per-person greenhouse gas emission reduction targets set by CARB. Most regions have now gone through 2 planning cycles, and CARB has verified that every region has created a plan that will meet the targets that CARB originally set in 2010, if implemented. This planning has led to new conversations about how regional plans can provide important economic, health, equity, and environmental benefits for Californians. Regions have also seen success implementing best practices to ensure those benefits are realized. And the state has played a role too. The state has set aside incentives such as those from cap and trade. Senate Bill 1 has provided needed transportation revenue, and most of those funds are directed to fixing existing infrastructure with historic increases in transit spending and active transportation investments. But have these been enough? And what progress are we actually realizing on the ground today? Last year, Senator Allen authored Senate Bill 150, posing that very question to CARB. And last week, CARB released its first report in response to this legislation. The report includes CARB's assessment of 1, what progress has been made in implementing SCS strategies and with what results for greenhouse gases and other outcomes. 2, what are the major challenges for implementation? And 3, what are some regional best practices and the impact of state policies and funding? As such, the report is both data and policy focused. It measures progress on 24 metrics and, where possible, compares them to the expectations set out in MPO's regional plans. The report also incorporates testimonials and lessons learned by those on the front lines of implementation. In preparing the report, we held meetings and interviews with regional agencies, the public, academics, state agencies, local government, builders, and community groups. After analyzing the input, we shared our preliminary conclusions in workshops and one-on-one meetings with MPOs, state agencies, and nonprofit groups, and then refined them. So now to share some results. A central finding of this report is that we are not on track to meet state climate goals under SB 375. As shown here, both greenhouse gas emissions in blue and vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, in red, per person are not much lower than they were in 2005 and are headed in the wrong direction. And in fact, we just added new data from 2017, and unfortunately, this trend is continuing. This falls far from the trajectory that we expected to be on based upon adopted plans, as shown there in the green dots. So when we are talking about VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, what we are talking about goes beyond just a single metric. It's really about the relationship between where people live, where people need to go, and the ways for them to get there. We want to make it easy for Californians to get around and do what they want to do efficiently. This is key both to achieving state climate goals and also produces many other valuable outcomes, from reducing congestion to saving families money to improving public health. Although it appears that the state is unlikely to meet its SB 375 targets for 2020, I do want to be clear that the state has already met its overall greenhouse gas reduction targets for all sectors for 2020. But with transportation being California's largest source of emissions, meeting targets by 2030 will require us to improve performance in this area. To better understand the rise in greenhouse gases, we looked at almost 24 indicators. This graph shows what portion of people drive alone to work for selected regions. And as you can see, about 3 out of every 4 people drive alone, a trend that is flat or rising in most regions. The Bay Area is an outlier in this, with a shrinking share of commuters driving alone to work. When I talk about regional results, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about what the MPOs are doing. What we're really talking about are the aggregate impact of hundreds of decisions by what may be dozens and dozens of agencies and private actors working together in a given region. We also looked at transit service and ridership. The graph on the left shows transit service hours per capita, and you can see that after a decline during the recession, it has almost returned to previous levels in most regions. These changes in service did affect ridership there on the right. You can see how they trend together until about 2014, when ridership began to fall independently. And in fact, this is happening in regions not just the most urban. Next, we looked at housing. In our interviews and in the last board and commission hearing, we heard that a lack of housing supply, particularly near job centers, was causing housing prices to rise, and that the affordability and displacement crisis is increasing how far people have to drive. And the data we saw shows that California is producing only a fraction of the homes that it did before the housing market collapse. The result is that the housing cost burden has grown. This shows what portion of rental households are paying over 35% of their income for housing in 2010 in gray, and in 2016 in red by income. This chart focuses on the Bay Area, but the results are fairly similar in most other large regions. And in general, you can see the housing burden has gone up, with particularly significant leaps in some income groups. The analysis method does not show what's happening in the lowest income groups, where the vast majority of households were already overburdened. But we believe the burden has continued to grow, and that the growing burden is causing real budget hardship and increasing homelessness. Not shown here, but we also found that households of color and Hispanic households have a greater burden than white non-Hispanic households. In looking into how this was occurring, we found that local cities and towns are completing their planning for housing at all income levels, but that the permits issued for lower income housing are falling far behind the need. These and other findings suggest that housing affordability and possibly also displacement may be increasing how far people have to drive. Our report also studied transportation spending. Over $1.1 trillion will be spent during the time period covered by adopted regional plans, so we wanted to understand more about how those funds were budgeted and what shifts were occurring in the budgets to align this spending with climate and other goals. These budgets, of course, reflect local, regional, state, and federal funds and funding decisions by many agencies. We found some positive shifts. Most of the large regions plan to increase the share of funds spent on road maintenance and decrease the share spent on road expansion. Transit spending, both on operations and capital, has risen significantly, those noted above, in some regions not by enough to maintain service at per capita pre-recession levels everywhere. Spending on active transportation has also been increasing. These positive shifts are supported by state policies such as SB 1, high-speed rail, increased funding for active transportation, and cap and trade. We also look to see whether there have been shifts in spending by mode, that is between roads, transit, and active transportation. And the largest four regions, looking at it in this macro level, we did not find a significant shift between the most recent two plans, between the current plan and the one before that, in planned transportation, as we would have expected. And when we asked whether a shift would have occurred if we had gone back one further plan to look just pre-SB 375, we were told that in these regions it would probably look fairly similar. Before I leave the metrics section, we want to acknowledge that there are many issues that the numbers currently cannot capture. There are metrics that are difficult to measure or where the data do not exist. For example, if someone living in a disadvantaged community with low transit service can't get to a job interview or to a job, their commute is not going to show up in the commute data. Or if someone is displaced and cannot afford to live near their job, our current data is insufficient to tell us even how much extra driving that results in, much less what this does to their support networks or to the neighborhoods where this displacement is occurring. On the other hand, when a family lives in a neighborhood where they can conveniently walk or bike to work, to the market, to parks, if their young teens can walk to school and to their friends' homes, and if seniors can stay in the same neighborhood after they no longer drive, it is hard for us to report what this extra time and freedom mean, either for the climate or for people's health and quality of life. So the report shows that we are not on track, but the real question is, why are we falling short, and what will it take to change this? The intent of the report is not to blame any one group or entity. These outcomes are the results of all entities carrying out their mandates and acting within the structure of current incentives, law, and policies. And progress has certainly been made, as I've been highlighting, and we heard about multiple opportunities, both existing and emerging, tools, laws, and funding sources for agencies to do more. Every agency could take useful steps now and has a crucial role to play. These joint meetings can even be a place for us to put forward ideas and implement solutions. But what has happened so far is not enough to enact the scale of change needed. And in the many interviews and consultations that we held for this report, we heard about the many barriers, competing mandates, incentives, and restrictions that have limited how well state, regional, and local agencies have been able to advance sustainable communities. The report finds that there is a fundamental disconnect between the factors that shape regional growth and development, such as how infrastructure funds are spent and the policies shaping growth and development, and the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. So as a state, we are not on track. We need to improve on how we build and invest in communities and transportation. We need to make more significant policy changes identified through a collaborative process to do this successfully. As a starting point, the report identifies 8 priority challenge and opportunity areas. Many of these align well with the 4 points that Director Branson proposed as a focus area last time for CARB and CTC collaboration. Of these 8, I will now highlight 3 where the authorities and ongoing work of the CARB and CTC would allow us to use this forum to advance early action. We put these forward for your consideration to ask whether further discussion at an upcoming joint meeting would be worthwhile. First, funding. CARB heard in numerous interviews and workshops that a critical test of SB 375's progress was whether investments are shifting in ways that improve transportation choices. And there have been definite improvements in this area via SB 1, programs led by the Strategic Growth Council, new housing funds, and other state efforts. Regions have been taking action as well. For example, some are publicly ranking transportation projects to prioritize those that best meet regional goals. But overall, state funding is generally not well aligned with health, equity, conservation, and climate goals. A number of complex factors such as historic formulas, fragmented decision-making authority, local sales tax commitments, and political forces are holding spending in place. The action plan and this joint body could recommend improvements to relevant state transportation, housing, and climate incentive funding guidelines and plans, and outline how to increase scrutiny on projects that may perform poorly on key goals, especially when state funds will be utilized. Second, underserved communities. In preparing this report, we reviewed research outlining the large disparities that unfortunately still exist from historic and systemic injustices. Regional planning offers an opportunity to begin to address a range of social and transportation justice issues: rural mobility, public health, affordable housing, and quality of life for people who have been unjustly burdened. We found some regions adopting best practices, such as conducting needs assessments, using transportation funding to reward localities for affordable housing, using participatory budgeting to select transportation projects, and more. Every region handles this differently, and stakeholders suggested to us that there is an opportunity for the state to provide more support and guidance. For example, while important work is going on around the state, currently there does not exist a unified state vision or strategy for underserved communities to improve travel choices, economic development, health outcomes, and access to jobs, affordable housing, and other opportunities. Next, new mobility. New technologies such as smartphones have begun a revolution in how we travel and communicate. The benefits of things like ride-hailing, scooter sharing, and eventually fully automated vehicles could improve travel choices, especially for those who need them most, and get people around more efficiently. But without policies to shape their deployment, they may also increase congestion and pollution and reduce transportation equity. California's 4 largest regions have launched a future mobility research program to study these issues and begin developing policy. Some are already pilot testing how new mobility strategies can support traditional public transit and transportation demand management, and helping local agencies design mobility hubs. We recommend that a think tank be convened to identify the transformative technologies, partnerships, policies, and critical steps to ensure that these innovations foster greater livability and provide clear environmental benefits. The report identifies other challenges that the action plan could address as well, and regional best practices and state efforts to build upon. These include preserving and increasing homes for for low-income households and making it easier to build homes, especially in key areas. Traveler incentives and changing the travel experience to encourage new travel choices. An example of this would be the Orange County Business Council's Just One Trip a Week campaign with the city of Irvine to encourage travelers to try new choices. Third, transportation pricing. Fourth, addressing data and research needs. And finally, addressing the limitations of SB 375 to make maximum use of the substantial work that currently goes into regional planning. The report recommends that a high-level interagency body be asked to facilitate collaboration and produce a joint action plan to address these 8 challenges. Currently, there is not a group or program set up to do all of this. However, this could build upon the ongoing work of many agencies and collaboratives working at specific intersections, including CARB's scoping plan work, Caltrans's California Transportation Plan, and others. As noted above, individual agencies also have important work that they have done and can do, but we believe we will not succeed without a public forum for collaborating across agencies and scales to find synergies across our mandates and identify new solutions. We recommend that this action plan identify responsible parties at the state, regional, and local level, set timelines for work on policy, investment strategies, and research, and recommend improvements to state law. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all very much for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Carrie. I do want to recognize Laura here. I think I see you in this last slide, our CTC ACE staffer. There you are. Okay, perfect. A picture speaks 1,000 words, so there you go. So anyway, questions, comments from my colleagues up here? Ooh. Okay, Dan, Dr. Sperling, I guess I'm supposed to say.
I guess we're being formal today.
No, I'm going to call you Dan.
I just want to add my support for this. You know, I think the Air Resources Board has come a long ways in appreciating how what we do relates to all of these other sectors. I mean, we look around and we see there's huge problems with housing, congestion's getting worse, transit's struggling. We have accessibility problems. And I think the staff report was very good in saying we're all in this together. So I'm hoping today that we can come to an understanding that we do need to work together on this, that none of our agencies, no one group, no one person is going to be able to change this. But we do have the great state of California, but the great state of California is suffering some serious challenges. And I think the time is now to address it. Housing and climate, traffic congestion, accessibility, these are all things we ought to be able to agree to, that are challenges that we need to work together on, and we haven't. And I think, I'm pleased we're meeting today here, but I think we need to get our minds focused that we really can't just keep meeting. We got to do something about it.
Thank you, Dan.
Chair.
Yes, Chair Frazier.
Just like to read a little bit of a statement prior to the meeting really kicking off, and I just want to thank the chairs for both initiating this meeting today on this important issue. The version of SB 150 by Senator Ellen that you see in law today was carefully crafted in my committee. The language that dictates what the report should include was negotiated with a wide variety of stakeholders, which helped remove all of the opposition from this bill. The intent of my committee in improving SB 150 was to provide a status report on the implementation of SB 375, the mandate on regions, and a way to share MPO successes, stories and barriers placed on them by state policies. It was not, and I repeat, not intended to be a punitive measure or in any way call for a reorganization of the way the state funds and implements transportation projects. I'm concerned that this report could serve as a blueprint to undermine our citizens' ability to make local decisions in the best interests of their communities by replacing our current process with a one-size-fits-all, top-down approach. This is not the way California does transportation and land use. This was not the intent of SB 375. We believe in local people making local decisions. As chair of the Transportation Committee and a member of the Assembly, I think my committee and many in my House will be skeptical of any legislation in this direction. I'm also concerned that the report neglects to address top priorities of our transportation system. The safety of the traveling public is paramount. Mobility and the economy have to be factors that are inclusive. In fact, goods movement, a major economic driver for the state, is not even being considered, which Mr. Corey and I have had several conversations about the freight industry being included in a top priority going forward. The report concludes that regions are not implementing their SCSs and must do more. Everyone needs to remember that since the passage of SB 375, we have experienced the Great Recession, we lost redevelopment, and we had a backlog of billions of dollars of basic maintenance needs for highways, bridges, and transit systems, not to mention the unprecedented need for housing. Even with the passage of SB 1, we still have a funding shortage in basic maintenance and safety, and it's going to take us decades to recover. Let's keep these things in mind as we can consider all of these issues today, and I look forward to today's presentations, but understanding that legislation that was passed in the past doesn't mean that it necessarily worked, and that it can be rescinded at the will of the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Any other comments? Yes, Commissioner Madaffer.
I didn't want to speak right after Dr. Sperling because it might look like we're ganging up. But, I have a couple of things. First of all, I was very pleased to hear it. I've certainly read the report. Kind of like as a futurist, I have a lot of concerns in much of what I read. I am concerned about declining transit ridership. I am concerned about poor land use decisions that are being made by local government where we are not getting the density and the housing along major transportation corridors. And I do think somehow or another there needs to, whether it be incentives or otherwise, methods to stimulate this. Hey, I used to be president of the League of California Cities, so nobody has to question my thinking when it comes to local control. But I also realize politics and NIMBYs keep needed workforce housing from getting developed. And I think if I take anything out of any of what I've read in the SB 150 report, is my grave concern that we're not doing enough to stimulate more workforce housing and affordable housing throughout the state of California. I also have a number of other issues that I'll probably talk about as we come forward in this, but just as kind of introductory, I remain concerned about congestion pricing. I understand it, I understand what it does, but at the same time, we also have to be mindful of the public. I understand the issues of developing more zero-emission vehicles. Let me share with you today when I arrived that I probably spent 15 minutes driving around in the parking structure here at Metro because there's inadequate signage to tell me where to plug in my EV vehicle. I've been driving, as most people know, I've been driving an all-electric car for over 5 years now. And it gets very frustrating for me when I come to a public place, especially this place, where I can't even find where to park. I finally found a spot, and it was great. And it was great to see many are filled up. But I just spent the last 20 minutes downloading an app and putting in my credit card number so I have the ability of actually charging my car while I'm here, so I'll have enough juice to get to Riverside for our commission meeting. So I just make these things that we're not doing a good enough job in this state if we really want to see the adoption of more zero-emission electric vehicles, especially if you show up here at LA Metro. And you would think that would be it. Lastly, you mentioned something that I was intrigued by. While I love the recommendation, and I agree with it, that there should be some kind of a joint committee, and I think it should include legislators, I think it should include transportation commissioners, I think it should include CARB members, to really foster a future perspective on this, where I really feel we're a little short. And I hope, Mary, you and the folks at CARB can prove me wrong, is in the area of technology advancements. Too often, I see fundamental shifts in transportation over the next decade to where car dealerships as we know them today will probably be gone 20 years from now. I really question whether or not buses that go by with nobody in them is really an effective use of our tax dollars when you could probably just give somebody a smartphone. I understand the issues of, I've seen the slide, 200 people being moved in their own cars, 200 people being moved in Lyfts and Ubers, and 200 people in a car, in a train, and 200 people in a bus. I've seen that and I get that. But I think using technology, we can bring people together through pooling and other things. So I would hope as we talk about this, we do not ignore the advancement, the rapid advancement that's happening right now in technology. Let's not miss the boat.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, Commissioner Mistral, and then we'll go to Jen. Or Judy.
Yes, we can go by first names. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Badaffer, for those comments. As Jim mentioned, he was president of the League of California Cities, and I followed shortly after Jim. So when we talk about local control, that's a mantra that we have pursued at the local level and will probably continue to pursue. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't approach these issues regionally, because transportation is a regional issue. It goes across county lines, it goes across all of our borders, and we need to be making sure that we're collaborating and synchronizing what we do. We also need to recognize the great diversity in the state, that what works for SCAG may not work for SANDAG, may not work for the Bay Area. So as we form this mobility action plan that we're talking about, you need to build into that the diversity that we're going to find as we work across regions. I've thought about this over the last few days because one of the things we do is we look at transit-oriented development. This is where we're going to put housing and transit together, and we're looking at building affordable housing. No question there's a need for housing and affordable housing. But I also look at that and turn it backwards. Like, what are we doing to provide access to transit, to mobility options for the neighborhoods that already exist? Because I notice in Los Angeles the way our geographical structure has been formed is major arterials run all across this city, and about one block off of those arterials, that's your neighborhood. And how can we better align what we're doing along the major arterials with those neighborhoods that are just one block away? I think that's an area that needs to be explored, and we can maybe find some solutions. The hard thing with SB 375 from the very beginning, I thought, was that it involves to such a high degree individuals' personal choices, what they can afford, where they can live, where they already work or where they're going to work, where their kids are going to school now or where they want their kids to go to school. So all those factors come into play when people decide on these choices, where we live and how we get to work. But one of the things I think that Jim mentioned that is really important is a vision for the future. And things are changing so fast that I think it's hard planning today to know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. But what we're seeing now out there, and GM announced this with their recent cutbacks, was they plan to be a company that provides mobility services. And this changes the landscape to a huge degree when we think about what does that mean. And I think that's something we should keep in mind as we plan for the future. What would we be doing in the way of providing mobility services? It might look different from the structure on the ground today with buses and light rail and TNCs. So I think we need to keep in mind, what is that going to look like in the future? How can we plan today for the changes that we are going to see in the next 10, 20 years? So it's not an easy task that we have before us. It is very challenging. Thank you.
Thank you. Judy, yes.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Dunn, Lucy?
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate the presentation, and thank you very much for very thoughtful comments. A couple of things, though, on the opportunity areas I just want to focus on. I think, first of all, you cannot discount the fact that notwithstanding the issues California has about a bit of a declining middle class, we've got very wealthy people and very poor people and a high poverty level in the state. However, we have a very strong economy as well. And when you look at that, I look back to the days of watching in the Great Recession. There wasn't that big an issue with a commute on these freeways because no one was employed. And now we've got full employment, and a car means freedom and opportunity and mobility for people. So we have to not take that away to be able to create wealth for those disparaged areas or the lower economic bases. We have to allow them to create wealth in a good economy. God knows we're going to be in a recession. Who can predict when? So we need to plan for that. But a strong economy produces what we're seeing today with mobility and congestion. So I think that's important to remember. The second thing is I want to really make very strong. We talk about affordable housing all the time. This state is so far behind. We need all housing, not just, quote, affordable housing. We need housing in all income categories everywhere. We haven't met our housing goals since 1989. This is long before even the Great Recession. So let's think about ways in our opportunity areas to reduce barriers that exist for producing housing for all income categories in order to meet climate change goals. It's a tweaking of the words, but it matters, I think, well to a mindset when we say state targets, blah, 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 as opposed to reducing barriers to meet our goals. You know, I mean, I've said this before, right? CEQA is a problem in this state. It's the holy grail for reform, and yet we make it impossible to meet climate change goals in transportation, in housing, without looking at things that are adding barriers to achieving the goals. Really important to phrase it in a way that I guess gets people motivated. The other one I want to share with you is I really commend Mr. Medaffer on the technology. I am so there. Having just ridden Metrolink this morning from Orange County to LA, impossible to figure out where a train schedule is on the internet. impossible to align schedules between Metrolink and Amtrak to make it easier for someone that doesn't do this every day how to get here. And the safety aspect, I just happened to be in a car where a mentally ill person started to engage another passenger. There's no sign on the wall that gives me a text so that I can text someone to say, could we get someone in this car very quickly? Safety is critical. I am very safe in the bubble of my car, even as I'm sitting in traffic. I did not feel safe this morning on Metrolink. And fortunately, that person got off the train so that there wasn't an altercation. But that's a really important component for technology, is accessibility to be able to pull up a schedule, which is why the grassroots campaign of trying to teach people how to read a schedule, I think, and not be afraid of it, but also to feel that they're safe when they do ride transit, I think is critically important. And then the last piece is especially for us, this joint meeting with CTC and CARB. Remember, a lot of these projects have just been funded. The ATP projects are not yet producing measurable results. I ask every single time I see an ATP funded project, how many cars did it take off the freeway today when you created this bike lane? Well, Lucy, we haven't built it yet. We just funded it. And there's no connective tissue yet between, and how do you measure bike lanes? How do you measure safe routes to school? How do we get that lineup of SUVs that drop their kids off at schools every single day, but it's safe to walk in their city? Why aren't they allowing their kids to walk? How do we measure those ATP projects when they're just getting built? So be gentle with us and be gentle with ourselves as we figure those metrics out to be able to encourage good behavior in the future. So that's where I would ask is think about reducing barriers on all of these things as we move forward to address these goals. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Dunn. Yes, Chair Nichols.
Seeing no other hands up at the moment, I wanted to do what I usually do with our board. I didn't give opening remarks, so maybe this is a wrap-up because we have other reports and things to hear from as well. So just to put this item in some context, if I may, SB 375, when it passed, was an attempt, I believe, to bring local governments and MPOs into the climate process and to recognize the fact that even if we were to achieve our goals, we wouldn't be able to maintain them over time without a land use and transportation system that collectively could provide the services that people want, maintain prosperity in our state, and at the same time reduce our emissions somehow. And I participated in a number of the preliminary meetings and workshops that led to the establishment of the regional goals and the metrics and the measurement technique that was based on a concept of greenhouse gas emissions per capita. So not to cap growth, not to do anything to restrain it, but simply to recognize that as we grow, we were going to have to find ways to emit less. What this report shows, I believe, is that the incentives that were built into 375, which mainly involved exemption from CEQA review for climate emissions for projects that were consistent with these sustainable community strategies, is not enough to, at least in the short term, make the kind of change that people thought was going to need to be made. That's it. That's what it shows. And I think the facts are pretty clear about that. What you do about this, where this leads you in terms of your thinking, could depend on many different factors. And I think it's worthy of discussion if we all agree that our joint missions, our joint and several missions, could lead us to some ideas that might do better. But it doesn't say how or or where or when. In fact, I think the suggestion even of a new body or a new plan is questionable in and of itself. Personally, I've, having participated in so many of these over so many years, we might decide to go in a completely different direction. But I do hope that people will look at it simply for what it is and not feel like it necessarily requires us to respond in any particular fashion other than to recognize that there's an issue here and that we might want to try to do something about. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to Commissioner von Konynenberg, and then I think we need to move to our next item. But yes, Paul.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, Commissioner Burke, so we'll do Paul and then.
You want to go first? Oh, okay, all right. Okay. Well, I want to, first of all, thank ARB staff for Deputy Director Weiss and I had a briefing on Friday with ARB staff, and I really appreciate you taking the time to brief me. So I have a couple concerns. I agree with Dr. Sperling that that we should collaborate, bringing our own disciplines to the table to collaborate on future efforts. I guess one thing that jumps out at me, part of collaboration, I think one thing would be really super helpful. I noticed in the footnote at the beginning of the report is that the document was reviewed by the staff of ARB, but not reviewed by your board. I similarly got the sense that even though it was mandated that this be done with the MPOs, that they were consulted but not given a chance to comment on a draft before it came forward in a meaningful way. So if we're to collaborate, one of the first things, one of the first things I would suggest is that reports like this, that we actually work together on them in the future. If we're going to be real collaboration, we need to work on these together, and we need to work with our partners who are on the ground doing the work. That would be my first suggestion. I think the other, I would like to echo Commissioner Dunn's comments regarding the SCF plans. Those SCF plans, remember, we were in a funding drought, so they've been in place for 10 years, but we've been in a funding drought for about 8 of those years. And so now we're starting to see projects actually get funded out of those. So the results, we won't see those results for another 10 years. So I think it's unfair to measure saying that the SCS plans are ineffective until they get to the point where they've actually moved the needle. And then finally, I had an opportunity to discuss VMT as a metric of success, of if that's the measurement of success. And I thank staff for elaborating when they say VMT, what all that's included in that term. I think another metric is gas and diesel consumption. If we were to see gas and diesel consumption go down significantly over the next 10 years, I think that's also could be a metric, because that would really be reflective of tailpipe emissions. So having more metrics than just, I think we should open it up to what the metrics of success are. Even though VMT has a lot of things behind that, I'd like to see more metrics of success used as we go forward. Thank you, and I'm sorry for taking us a little long.
No, thank you. I think that's exactly what I hoped for, was people to.
I would just like to say something very briefly. When we looked at 375, we were in a different environment, and some things have changed. We no longer have a redevelopment agency in all localities. I was very impressed by the housing portions in this report, and the fact that certainly 375 talked about transportation as it relates to moving forward in terms of the housing element. At our table, we should have those funders for low and moderate income housing. I don't say that we have to have a new group set up, but we have to have some mechanism for bringing into our discussions We don't have redevelopment agencies, but we have tax credits that are made available to many people in order to meet the 375 goals. I just think that we need to make sure that they're at the table.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you. I'll be
No, in full disclosure, you're working with a left-handed chair, so that's all I can say.
okay. That's good.
Diane, I wasn't slighting you, and I'll try to
No,
look
that's
over
fine.
my shoulder a little better.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly add a couple thoughts. One, I just really want to thank the staff, the CARB staff. I feel like there's been an enormous effort, and in addition to the amazing data collection and analysis that you've done, I had the opportunity to come to a couple of the community meetings that were held, and I felt like those were really a Herculean effort, and I know that they happened all over the state, and I just want to express my deep appreciation that you reached out in the way that you did, that they were community friendly, they were accessible, and I think that the voices of impacted communities are really reflected in this report. So I think it's really important that we really acknowledge that, and I want to say thank you for that. I guess for me, I feel like the solutions are not are going to be long-term and they're going to be short-term, and I think that's what everyone is kind of saying. We really can't undo 100 years of poor planning that was really focused around a car culture. We've been, as a gentleman from LA Metro kind of said, we've been pretty successful at that, and now we found that that really doesn't work for our health, for air quality, for the quality of life that we have in our communities, and particularly for disadvantaged communities and environmental justice communities. I think this intersection that you've incorporated in the report of housing and transportation and taken it to the next level and really analyzed it is really critical, because those are both places where disadvantaged communities suffer and where they need assistance. So I really appreciate the focus there, and I also want to lift up Dr. Sperling's point that we really need to focus on action, and understanding that there are longer-term solutions that we need to look at, but we don't have time for just long-term planning. We need to have action now. And I like the idea of the committee or the task force, but I don't like the idea of more meetings that don't get us to action. So I also appreciated the more focused interventions that you talked about in your recommendations, and particularly those that would focus on community interventions where there may be simple, not that costly interventions that could happen in communities that get people on transit, that make them feel safe on transit, and also that would be something that people would embrace in different communities. That said, I also think we need some metrics and some rigor across the state. So what is the transit capacity per capita that should happen across the state? How do we look at that to ensure that all regions are actually looking at a transit capacity that's appropriate? And they should, as others have said, develop what the solutions are, like how do you get there, but that the capacity should be consistent across the state. I know we're gonna have time to talk more, but I just wanted to lift that up, and again, thank the staff so much for your great work.
Thank you, Diane. So I love the discussion, and I may get fired as chair, but Commissioner Arp, did you want to say something?
I know you've got to move on. I have a very short statement about action. Maybe one of the things we could do, should be a simple step, but it's not, and it wasn't when SB 375 was passed, is that we could include transportation in some of those incentives that were supposed to help move along some of this development. That was left out. And here we are talking about transportation today and SB 375, and no one has, they just kind of moved on. And you know what? Let's look at the basics as to what helps get projects online. There's some good projects that could help move some of these goals along, and they don't get those incentives that SB 375 offers other areas of development.
Thank you, Commissioner Arp. Thanks. That was a great start, I think, and I look forward to more robust if I could just add my little word, I would love to drill down a little bit more about jobs, because, to borrow a line from my fellow commissioner, jobs are where houses, or I'm sorry, houses are where jobs go to sleep at night. And I do think that we all agree we have a housing crisis. I don't think there's anybody in our state that isn't in an agreement on that, so clearly. And the nexus, we feel very strongly, the nexus between transportation and housing. When I hear of the commutes from the Bay Area with folks starting on their train ride at 4:30 a.m., taking a 3-hour ride and trying to do their job, and then 3 hours home and an hour each way for some transition, you don't have a life, and that's not sustainable in the long term. You can't have justice for your family or your person or your community or your job. So I think for all of us to, and I really would like to drill more and understand more about the jobs. And also, jobs have changed. We talked about technology and how the world is changing so rapidly. The young millennials are kind of consulting now, and they don't get hired for that lifetime career anymore. They may work for several folks at the same time, and I think we have to really drill down. So I do want to thank you for the work, and I would say we've got a lot of work, and this did just come out. So I think one of the things we can do is everybody have a time where we can maybe go chapter by chapter and have some robust discussions about what the solution sets to work on first. And I love the ideas of figuring out some short-term as well as long-term, because we get discouraged. You know, if we're only looking at long-term and it takes so long, we need some attaboys along the way, I think, in terms of improving, and whether it's safety, security, signage, whatever, we can do the list, and let's celebrate together some early success and some long-term success. With that, hey Doug, let's call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Alvarado? Yes. Commissioner Burke? Here. Commissioner Dunn? Here. Commissioner Arp? Here. Commissioner Gilmetti? Present. Commissioner Guardino?
Present.
Commissioner Kehoe?
Here.
Commissioner Tavaloni? Here. Commissioner Madaffer?
Here.
Commissioner Van Konynenberg? Here. Chair Inman?
Here.
Member Frazier?
Here.
Madam Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. We're going to call our colleagues' roll, please.
Dr. Bombs? Mr. De La Torre? Here. Mr. Eisenhut? Senator Flores?
Here.
Assembly Member Garcia? Supervisor Joya? Senator Lara? Ms. Mitchell? Here. Mrs. Reardon? Here. Supervisor Roberts? Supervisor Cerna? Dr. Sheriffs?
Here by virtue of active transit.
Professor Sperling?
Hooray.
Ms. Takborian?
Here.
Vice Chair Berg? Chair Nichols?
Here.
Madam Chairs, we have a quorum.
Educational combination.
Thank you so much. Okay, trying to get our agenda back to some timing. I'm going to move to item number 4, and we are delighted to have Maura with us today to give us an overview. Thank you. Maura Toomey.
Good morning, commissioners and board members. I'm Maura Toomey from the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments. And on behalf of my MPO partners, I first want to thank both the California Transportation Commission and the Air Resources Board for the opportunity to provide an overview of the RTP SCS process and its highlights, challenges, and needs. I'm first going to provide some background on the development of the RTP SCS, including first our partner agencies, the relationship between the California Transportation Plan and regional transportation plans, the statutory requirements for the development of the RTP SCS, and the need for long-term, equitable, sustainable revenue to support implementation. Just as it takes a village to raise a child, it takes many partners to develop and implement an RTP SCS. In addition to our local jurisdictions and federally recognized tribal governments, the successful development of any RTP SCS relies on collaborative partnerships like those with you. The California Transportation Commission, who is responsible for the development of the RTP guidelines and is a funding partner, and the Air Resources Board, who is responsible for establishing GHG reduction targets and accepting or rejecting the MPO's determination that the SCS would, if implemented, meet the GHG reduction target. We also have many other partners, including the Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administrations, who review and approve our plans for compliance with the Clean Air Act, the FAST Act, the Civil Rights Act, and many other federal regulations. Failure to comply with federal requirements can render MPOs ineligible to spend federal funding. We also are partners with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, who works collaboratively with FHWA and FTA to ensure our plans conform with the Clean Air Act requirements. Caltrans, who reviews plans for consistency with state law and is responsible for the development of the California Transportation Plan. The California Department of Housing and Community Development, who is responsible for certifying the regional housing needs allocation process. The California Department of Public Health, who advocates that positive health outcomes continue to be an integral part of the planning process. And there are many other partners, including the Strategic Growth Council, the Office of Planning and Research, Air Quality Management Districts, and other MPOs. As regional planning and statewide planning become more integrated, the California Transportation Plan, or the CTP 2040, provides an aspirational statewide transportation system vision, a vision capable of meeting mobility, safety, sustainability, and economic objectives in the fight against climate change. However, unlike the regional transportation plans, the CTP 2040 is not financially constrained, nor does it undergo CEQA review, and it is not required to be consistent with air quality conformity requirements. And speaking of those requirements, the RTP SESs are required to meet more than 70 federal and state requirements. They're also required to be consistent with 7 national transportation goals, 8 Federal Transportation Administration policies, and 11 state goals. This creates a tug-of-war between goals and priorities for scarce resources. It took 362 pages worth of RTP guidelines to outline all these requirements. Yes, 362 pages. A few of the resulting plans are on the table before you. And all of these requirements and goals must be met in an era of decreasing resources. 30% less gas will be consumed in 2035 than 2005 under existing regulations. As you can see by the chart in front of you, gasoline consumption, the blue line, begins to decline in 2015, but that decline becomes even greater after 2020. As fuel consumption decreases, so do transportation revenues collected through federal and state gas taxes. The next slide you will see starts to highlight the connection between fuel consumption and the Federal Highway Trust Fund, a major source of transportation for all the regions. The Federal Highway Trust Fund is on an unsustainable course due to necessary increases in fuel efficiency and the resulting decline in gas tax revenues. Let me focus your attention on 2020, as it is an important year as we move to the next slide. Based on the latest Congressional Budget Office estimate, the Federal Highway Trust Fund becomes insolvent by the year 2021. What does that mean? This means that the federal government is not anticipated to collect enough revenue to meet its financial commitments to transportation. This creates uncertainty in the delivery of transportation system as outlined in the region's RTP SCSs. Will the federal government resolve this funding issue? Absolutely. How it's resolved, however, will impact the implementation of each region's RTP SCS. Declining fuel consumption is also an impact on state gas tax revenues. Under the scoping plan scenario, this problem is expected to grow worse, with fuel consumption under the scoping plan 60% lower in 2035 than it was in 2005. Federal funding makes up roughly 16% of the investments from the 5 regions you'll hear from later today. That's just over $130 billion. In my region, we spend an additional $1.2 billion of federal funds. This creates uncertainty under which to deliver the RTP-SCS. The commissioners and commission staff may well remember a similar dilemma in 2010. As you can see, finding predictable, equitable, sustainable transportation funding solutions is critical to the success of California meeting its climate, equity, health, economic, and transportation safety goals. On the state side, SB 1 provided $52 billion of new funding for transportation, the first increase in reliable funding in more than 20 years. However, this $52 billion is only about a third of the $138 billion needed above and beyond the RTP-SCS investments to adequately maintain the state highway and local road system. And that $138 billion does not include the $135 billion required for transit maintenance. As we've discussed before, as if our transportation funding needs are not daunting enough, let's talk about housing. As the RTP-SCS is about building livable, sustainable communities, which require housing. The Twin Rivers project in Sacramento, pictured on the slide before you, seeks to implement the SACOG's region's RTP-SCS. Unfortunately, the sponsors applied for affordable housing, sustainable communities funding, and transformative climate community funding to no avail. Although I highlight the project in the Sacramento region, there are many projects in every region of the state similar to this one. All this is to say, project sponsors are taking strides to implement the regional SCSs. Unfortunately, the resources to support these projects are woefully inadequate. To point, roughly $2.5 billion was requested from the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities program in the last 3 fiscal years. Only $470 million was awarded. That's a more than $2 billion shortfall in funding. Approximately 4 out of every 5 projects that applied for this program did not receive funding. Each of the projects that applied was required to be consistent with regional RTP SCSs and illustrate the desire to implement the SCS. Funding, however, woefully lacks behind the need. So this provides just a quick overview of the RTP SCS development constraints. This afternoon you'll hear presentations from MTC, San Joaquin COG, SACOG, SANDAG, and SCAG that will focus on RTP SCS successes and challenges, what the MPOs have learned to date, what we need, and the policy recommendations that support the implementation of their RTP SCSs. That concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Maura. Questions for Maura? Okay, I'm looking over the side. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it and love those images. Those charts help us a lot. So, okay, we're going to move on to the next presenter, Chris Smith, I believe.
Good morning, commissioners and board members. Glad to be here. And I'm Chris Schmidt, the Division Chief for Transportation Planning for Caltrans, and I just want to share with you some Caltrans perspectives on this very important topic. So my presentation overview has just a few highlights here of some topics I want to cover, the role that we have in this entire process, some of what's going on where we feel we're already moving in the right direction collectively, Some discussion about transportation funding, as you heard from Maura, and some of those requirements that the MPOs are required to comply with. The transportation vision moving forward, some opportunities to leverage some ongoing efforts that we're already engaged in, fostering additional collaboration through the development of the next California Transportation Plan, the plan for 2050, and then some opportunities for strategic alignment. So Caltrans' role in all of this is a statewide leader in collaboration and partnering. Caltrans is entrusted with efficiently managing and preserving and protecting California's transportation system, which is one of the state's most vital assets. At the same time, we recognize that we need to balance mobility demands and economic vitality with environmental equity and health considerations. We recognize that California needs a robust, multimodal, sustainable transportation system, and we acknowledge that we have a strong role to play in helping the state meet its GHG reduction goals. We have new perspectives on what the transportation system needs and how to get there. While historically capacity changes are, while capacity changes are still appropriate, and in some cases, that is not our first go-to strategy any longer. We now look at a fix-it-first approach with preservation of the system as a key goal, and also looking at increasing the efficiency of the existing system. We're also embracing performance management and sustainability. Early on, Caltrans was a member that helped initiate the State Coordinating Committee, a multi-agency effort that laid the foundation for legislation that created the Strategic Growth Council. Also, Caltrans initiated the Regional Blueprint Planning process, which was another foundational effort that led to some of the modeling improvement efforts that enabled MPOs to start complying with SB 375. So we've been collaborating for some time. As far as moving in the right direction, you've heard already that there's been great success in just getting to where we are today, and more needs to be done. We do want to underscore, though, since the passage of AB 32 and SB 375, much has been achieved. MPOs have adopted SCSs, and they have been approved by ARB. And as you'll hear later on, there have been a number of accomplishments, and there are still a tremendous number of challenges in implementing those SCSs and achieve the desired outcomes. But great strides have been made in other areas as well. For example, in terms of active transportation, as was mentioned earlier, we have a very robust funding program. We're seeking a tremendous number of projects to be funded, and certainly given the number of projects submitted and the funds available, it's a much oversubscribed program. The SB1 transit grant programs, for example, are also strengthening the transit infrastructure and services. You've heard a little bit about that today. The intercity rail projects and commuter rail programs are seeing dramatic increases in ridership. Other transit success stories include the expansion of bus rapid transit and BART. And while transit ridership overall has been a challenge, as we're seeing some of the declining trends, investments in high-quality transit is seeing ridership growth, and that should continue as more of those investments come online and those services are made available. So the other thing that you heard earlier, Metro is doing as well, funding programs are transitioning the transit fleet to zero-emission vehicles, and that's also very important as we make that investment in our infrastructure. Looking at congested urban highway corridors, the department is embracing a corridor approach. And what we mean by that, we're looking at all modes within a corridor today. In many cases, the best solutions for solving our congested highway delays are really making investments in new and improved transit services. An example of how we operationalize that is through the new Solutions to Congested Corridor program, which embraces a multimodal corridor investment strategy. And it really sets the expectations that projects will actively manage those corridors for success. Where new highway lanes are added in the program, they must be managed lanes. And funding eligibility for that program is hinged on having an adopted SCS in place within the region. So the connection is quite strong there. I also want to just highlight a little bit of what Maura highlighted earlier relative to how we conduct this planning. The planning funds for the regions come from two sources, the federal and the state side. And really on the federal side, we've got $63 million that we allocate annually to the 18 MPOs. And they've got to comply with all the things that Maura mentioned, so I won't belabor that point too much. The one that she didn't mention is at the bottom, the Federal Transportation Performance Management Requirements. And there's a number of goals that the federal government actually puts on the state as well as on the regions to achieve certain system performance. And those goals are actually somewhat in conflict with some of what we're talking about today. For example, there is no federal performance measure or goal for GHG reduction. So as we work together, we want to make sure that the planning funds that come from the federal government are used to deal with the federal mandates, and that the state planning funds are used to address those state requirements. And that's a balancing act that the regions always have to play, and we help to facilitate that. On the next slide, I just want to highlight a few of the key things that some of the MPOs are doing, both large and small. These are the specific SB1 Transportation Planning Fund dollars that we're providing through the new SB1 program. And I would submit to you that all these MPOs are really trying to do innovative things to figure out how to get their SESs implemented and to be successful. So what is that transportation vision that we're shooting for? Maura mentioned it earlier in the CTP 2040, what the vision is for that. What we're really looking for is a vision that provides mobility choices that enables Californians to opt out of congestion. And it means that we have to develop and implement strategies that offer transportation choices that people don't have to experience congestion or contribute to congestion. So we need to get there. It means that we need robust transit, extensive active transportation networks, and an efficient state highway system. We got to make the system work better, among other things. These approaches are not only good for VMT reduction, which we're talking about here, but they can also be applied in corridor-based approaches leveraging system management strategies. That's sort of a euphemism for pricing. And emerging technologies that's been mentioned here a number of times definitely need to be fully explored to really provide key choices that commuters really want. So how do we do that? Well, we should leverage some of the things that we're already doing and things that are already underway to achieve that vision. We propose really to leverage the existing partnerships that we have to achieve these desired outcomes. One example on the leveraging that we're doing at the state level is we have a housing and transportation work group. They just met here in November. Representatives from Caltrans, ARB, HCD, OPR, and several other agencies meet and actually talked about some of those housing and transportation challenges, and also how to inform the administration on what to do moving forward. We can also leverage the many other advisory committees that we have in place, such as those that are addressing freight issues that were brought up earlier, active transportation, and other key mobility challenges that we have around the state. We also pride ourselves in leveraging the relationships that we have with our regional partners, especially the relationship with CalCog, the Rural Counties Task Force, and the Self-Help Coalitions. Those are key partners in really discussing where those changes can be done systemically. We also have in place robust research programs. ARB, Caltrans, and the Strategic Growth Council all fund and support research efforts, and we can certainly gear our research efforts in the right directions. In addition, Caltrans is making an effort to explore big data to better help us. There was a discussion earlier about ATP and data supporting ATP mode share changes. Big data is a way to help us understand what travel behavior is doing in the future. And then also, we are interested in the VMT metric. We are very much see the benefit of using that metric in terms of measuring the environmental impacts of projects, and we plan to continue to work with our partners to figure out how best to implement. So quickly, in terms of CTP 2050, we see that as a fostering opportunity for collaboration, both amongst the state agencies, the general public, but really also with our regional partners. You heard earlier, and it's a fair critique, this is an aspirational plan. It can set a large-scale framework on some of the things we wish to do. It is not intended to be fiscally constrained. It does not go through CEQA, but it needs to be reasonable. It needs to be feasible. It can't just be completely pie in the sky. The key thing, it is statutorily mandated, it is funded, it is staffed, it is guided by the guidelines that the Commission has adopted for the development of the CTP. It is an opportunity to really collaborate, and we would submit to you that there is a process in place to do that and opportunities to foster that collaboration. The plan itself tries to really address some of the key priorities that were called out in the 150 report, the technology, the equity, housing, the public health, the adaptation. Those are all issues that we're already hearing about from the general public as we're doing our outreach. We do want to focus on innovation. We're looking for what is the future. We have a Future of Mobility white paper that highlights a lot of those ideas and challenges and opportunities. How do we get those into the plan and make them a reality? We also want to think about scenarios. Where do we really want to be? What likely outcomes do we want to see? And how can we analyze means by which to get there? So tremendous opportunity there. The plan itself is being developed as we speak. As I mentioned, we're just kicking off most of the key aspects to it. In 2019 will be the primary heavy lift portion, and then we hope to have an adoption in 2020. So a lot of opportunity there to collaborate. And finally, I would just say, in terms of strategic alignment, you know, as the 150 report indicates, and we've been discussing here today, there's lots of issues that influence travel behavior. I think that's pretty clear to all of us. Transportation investments and how the system is managed are important factors in delivering a safe and efficient and low-carbon transportation system that we all want. But there's lots of other issues. Certainly, clearly, housing, land use policies have a huge influence on travel behavior. And we have to continue the discussions here, discussions through the CTP development, and really discussions in all the other forums that take place to figure out how to get that collaboration to occur. And clearly, this strategic alignment that addresses our mobility and environmental goals while also growing our economy, to your earlier comments about jobs and improving the quality of life for all Californians, is really what we're mostly trying to achieve. So I thank you for the opportunity and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chris. So I know we have a question from Commissioner Kehoe.
Thank you, Fran. Thanks for the presentation. Very good information. I've got an ongoing concern about transit. You know, we're seeing ridership go down, but I think I heard you say that when it comes to high-quality transit, we're seeing increases in ridership.
So investments that are really paying off are the kinds that are service quality is emphasized. Service that are frequent, they're safe, they're clean, they're well scheduled, they're understood by the customer.
And name some for me, please. What are your biggest success stories?
So some of what we've seen are the successes here in the LA Basin, the Silver Line, for example, some of the light rail projects that we've seen, the extensions of the light rail services. You know, those are different kinds of services. They're not the traditional, what historically we call traditional bus services. They're being reoriented to be on a pulse-based system where transfers are easier, where the connections are easier. The commuter rail investments that we've seen are similar to that, where we're seeing higher frequency services that are more robust and more reliable. And I think we're starting to see where those investments are being made in those higher quality services, you're attracting riders. Where the services have perhaps been not reoriented, where they've been functioning in congested condition, you're not seeing the same kind of ridership.
I think that's good news. I think that frequent scheduling, cleanliness, and safety are keys if we're going to get people to really think of transit as a legitimate alternative. And I also hope that there's more discussion at some point about how we can directly subsidize transit users, whether it's students, hospital users and employees, senior citizens. You know, we know where they're going. Is there some way they could have some sort of extra support and get them on buses and transit more often? So just a thought. Thank you, Fran.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments? Dan?
You know, I'm trying to restrain myself here, but
It's all good.
you know, the first step is we need to acknowledge we've got serious problems, and almost every metric is going in the wrong direction. And I'm not talking just environmental. And I think we need to, I know Chris knows this, and I know Caltrans knows it, and each agency, entity knows it in terms of their piece. But let me just repeat again, go through this list of how we need to really rethink what we're doing in transportation. I've studied transportation for decades. This is my profession as a researcher. And I think we need to be outcome oriented. So yeah, we can say there's lots of improvements being made. The MPOs are doing lots of little good things, and Caltrans doing lots of good things. But if you look at it big picture, I'm going to just go through these, one by one, just be very blunt. Congestion, it's getting worse. Safety, it's getting worse. We're seeing an increase in fatalities, which is the first time that's happened, actually per capita, that's the first time in history that's happened. The cost of travel is going up. The cost of buying a new car now is over $35,000 for a new car. Cost of owning and operated cars has gone up. There's funding gaps, as we've heard, so we don't have the money to deal with the infrastructure and all the other problems. Transit ridership. Okay, we used to not pick on transit because it's so important and we didn't have any good alternatives. But we've got to be more open-minded, clear-eyed about what's going on. Transit serves less than 2% of passenger miles in this state. So, and it's either flat or declining, and depending on where you're looking at it. But even if you doubled it, it's tiny. And we relate it to equity and accessibility. As it's been pointed out, we have these very high poverty rates. And that translates to a lot of people not having access to cars. And we have created a car-centric transportation system which marginalizes so many people in terms of income, in terms of physical disabilities. And just one little statistic to highlight it, taxis, the most expensive mode there is, 40% of taxi rides are by households with less than $25,000 income. Why are they doing it? Because they don't have good alternatives. People, even if they have cars, they're not reliable. And then of course, there's the transportation greenhouse gases. That's going up, unlike the other sectors in of our society, of our economy. So, this is not good news. And if we make minor incremental improvements, that's not going to address most of these. We've really got to acknowledge that something really big and different needs to be done, and it's not going to be simple, it's not going to be easy, but we have to, I think the first step is just acknowledging we've got a real problem here. And we haven't seen this in the transportation sector since interstate highways. So I just, I'd like to, it's going back to the point where first acknowledge it, and then we have to think about, there are all these new types of business models. Just as a little tiny example, these electric scooters. So there's lots of issues with them, but if we go back to what, Caltrans is saying, our number one strategy should be to increase choice and figure out how to make it work instead of just criticizing everything or saying it's a problem, but taking a more positive approach. We need to figure this out, and we're not doing it. And we do have the tools and the business models to make it a lot better, but we're not. Okay, let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you. Appreciate it. Commissioner Medaffer?
Just briefly, to pick up on that, if we could figure out ways through these efforts to embrace more of what the private sector is out there already doing. For me, this takes Commissioner Dunn's comment earlier today. I want an app, and they're out there. I don't care if it's Lyft, Uber, Waymo, they're all out there, that is ubiquitous to all forms of transportation. I want to pay for it out of one pot of money. I don't care if it's eventually when I pay for my miles, as we move to a per mile fee, which we know that's where we're going. If it's Amtrak, Metrolink, Coaster, I don't care what the label says. If it's a jump bike, if it's a Lime scooter, a Bird scooter, a taxi, I want to be able to punch up something right here and get on and move. And if it can aggregate me to somebody else who's going in the same place, all the better. And that's where I think we need to be looking.
Great. Anyone else? I would just add a little bit in terms of customer service, and y'all know my early roots from the hospitality sector, and I think everybody should start in the hospitality sector, because I think if we're really going to get people to have choices and make choices, we really, and I was encouraged to know that Phil is doing that. I know some of our other agency partners, but there's a lot of models out there who have really done customer retention. You know, we want to grow our ridership in some of these things, but what do we know about who's riding them? We were just up in the Monterey Salinas Transit Tour, and they've got a good handle, I believe. I mean, they told us that more than 52% of their riders ride 5 days a week or more. Well, that's a real different model than if you're riding 1 day a week. And so I think really to look at what are those barriers, and to, I forget who brought it up, it might have been Commissioner Dunn, somebody talked about freedom, mobility, and all the choices that people want to have. And then, you know, if you're trying to balance your family and work life and everything, and you've got to get kids to different places and you're hauling stuff, let's make sure that it's easy to do and roll your suitcase in here. So it's all good. I think people probably need a little protein, a little bit of lunch, so we're going to break for lunch. I'm going to ask Doug to give us some directions, but I have one ask for all of you out there. I'm really glad you're here, and we want to hear from everybody. I'm going to ask you, have lunch with somebody you don't know today, okay? Because we all just go to our comfort zone and talk to the same people we all talk to, but let's go visit with someone new today, find out what's keeping them up at night. So with that, Doug?